My name is Iris Thorne. I am 29 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I set the longest table in the harbour town of Padstow, Cornwall, and every chair at it was someone I had chosen. 22 chairs along the pine floor of my tea room, the second one from the head, reserved for a woman in her 70s with flour permanently creased into the folds of her knuckles who had once taught me, with her mouth against my ear in a flour-stormed kitchen down at Cadgwith, that bread could be a kind of prayer. The year I turned 8, my parents handed me a small green storm lantern and drove me 4 hours west onto the Lizard, the very last peninsula before the cliff drops away into the Atlantic, to a cottage above Cadgwith Cove. They stayed for tea and a slice of Aunt Ruth's lemon cake. Then my mother knelt on the porch step, smoothed a strand of hair out of my face, and gave me the sentence that would outlast my childhood. "Steady girls don't make a fuss." She kissed my forehead. My father lifted his mug in a kind of salute, his hand steady as any harbour clock, as it would be steady for the next 22 years of my life. And then they drove away east toward Falmouth Docks, where my younger brother Matthew was waiting to board a ferry to the Isles of Scilly. I did not make a fuss. I was already proficient in the craft of not making a fuss, which should have alarmed somebody. The lantern, by the way, had been bought in January. The trip had been booked the previous November. Nobody told me anything until June, which meant the plan to send me away had lived in that house for 7 full months before anyone had thought I deserved a sentence about it. When people ask me now why I left my family the way I left, quietly, with the details worked out in advance, I tell them the truth. I learned that method from my mother. She simply never imagined I would be the one carrying the lamp. For 10 summers after that, the shape of my childhood was identical. The second week of June, the green lantern went into the boot. For hours west, tea and lemon cake on Aunt Ruth's porch in Cadgwith, the car pulling away with 3 people in it. And then some week in August, a small parcel arrived. Glass jars with handwritten labels in a round schoolteacher's hand. Skye, Mull, the Outer Hebrides, the Faroes, the Aran Islands, Donegal, Connemara, the Dingle Peninsula, the Causeway Coast, Lundy. 10 summers. 10 jars. And every single one carried the same cheerful scrawl on the white label. "Wish you were here." Aunt Ruth would hand it over without a word, and later I would catch her sliding it into a wooden crate on the pantry shelf, like she was keeping evidence for a hearing nobody had set a date for yet. I used to read those labels the way other children read cereal boxes, hunting for a prize that wasn't there. It took me years to notice what was actually missing. Not once did a jar say, "We miss you." Not once did one say, "Next year you will come with us." The message was never an apology. It was a caption, "Look at the family having its island summer." To be fair to my parents, and I have spent years learning how to be exactly that fair and not one breath more, the story did not begin with a lantern. It began in a hospital. When Matthew was 6 and I was 2, he was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. I have no memory of his treatment, but I grew up inside its architecture. 2 years of chemotherapy, fundraisers at the parish church, a freezer full of lasagnas from the mums of St. Issy. My mother slept in a hospital chair beside his bed so many nights she could fold herself into it like a deck chair. My father worked night shift in the boat shed at Rock to keep Matthew's private cover. Somewhere in that long emergency, my family reorganized itself into a shape, and the shape had a center. The center was Matthew. I understand it. A boat on fire floats around the fire. Matthew got his remission in 1999. The bell. The balloons. A photograph that still hangs in my parents' hallway above a console table nobody is allowed to set anything on. He was 10. I was 6. That should have been the end of the emergency. Instead, it became the founding document. My parents came out of those years with a mission statement: make every memory for Matthew. They had almost run out of chances to make any, and they came out with a belief about me that hardened like epoxy in a tin. Iris is the easy one. Iris is healthy. Iris does not need anything. Here is the part one want you to sit with. The summers without me did not start during his treatment. They started in 2001. 2 summers after Matthew was cured. The emergency ended. The system it had built did not. Nobody ever looked at the small girl carrying her own storm lantern up the porch steps in Cadgwith and asked whether the triage was still necessary. Triage was simply how our family loved now. The summer I was 10, I made my case. The destination was Skye, and I wanted to see the old man of store so badly my teeth ached. I did it properly, too, because even at 10, I was a planner. I packed my own bag a week early. I made a list titled, Reasons I Should Come. The top reason was that I had never stood north of Inverness. I rehearsed my pitch in the bathroom mirror with the door locked. Then I stood at the kitchen counter and delivered it, list in hand, while my mother dried dishes and my father leaned in the doorway, twirling his car keys around one finger. She put the towel down. She knelt, the pose she always took for the hard ones. Her voice went soft as flannel. This trip is for your brother, sweetheart. You understand. After everything he has been through. And then, when my chin did the thing I could not control, she tucked my hair behind my ear and finished me off with the family motto. Steady girls don't make a fuss. My father said nothing. That was his instrument. The whole orchestra of nothing. I went to my room. I did not make a fuss. And I heard the dishwasher start and the television and the ordinary sounds of a house that had already moved on. But here's the sound I never got over. Around 9 o'clock that night, I heard the small squeak of rubber boots on the kitchen tiles. I came to the top of the stairs and looked down. My green lantern was already packed, already cased, already parked by the front door. I had not touched it. Someone had answered my speech long before I had given it. I never asked to come along again. I had gotten my answer for all 10 years in a single night. Before I tell you about the kitchens I worked in and the door I chose instead, and I want you to know one thing. The photograph of me in the parish magazine that my mother would eventually recognize 12 years later? My father had already recognized me in a church newsletter 3 months before she did. He said nothing. We will come back to why. Trust me. If this were a simpler story, the summers themselves would have been the punishment. They were not. That is the kindness at the middle of my childhood. Aunt Ruth's cottage above Cadgwith Cove was the one place on earth where I was not the easy one, the steady one, the one who did not need anything. I was just Iris. Ruth was my mother's older sister, separated young, no children. She had spent 30 years cooking in a hotel kitchen up at Mullion before arthritis had bent her fingers too far to lift a tray. The cottage was her retreat, but she never stopped cooking. She kept one ancient Hobart stand mixer on the counter like a chapel relic and made soda bread every third day for anyone who knocked on a Tuesday. She put me to work the first week I ever stayed with her, and I do not mean pretend work. Real dough, real scale, real hotel supplier orders taped to the side of the fridge. She taught me short crust when I was 9, standing behind me with her hands over mine on the rolling pin. Cold hands, warm heart, she said, perfect for pastry. When I ruined a batch, she made me diagnose it like a doctor. Too much water, warm butter. Then we did it again. At her table I got asked questions, and my answers changed things. What we baked, what we planted, what we watched on the small television at the end of the night. I once heard her introduce me to a neighbor as her summer girl, and I walked around the rest of that day like I had been knighted. One night when I was 11, she looked at me across a peach pie for a long moment and said, "In this house you are not the quiet one. You are simply Iris." Then she seemed about to say something else. She did not. She got up and refilled my milk instead. All those summers, there were moments like that. Sentences she started toward and turned back from, like a woman walking to the edge of a pier and deciding the water was too cold. The summer I was 12, I found out what was on the other side of those unfinished sentences. It was late. I came downstairs for water. The kitchen light was on. Ruth was at the table with a phone pressed to her ear, and I stopped in the dark hallway because her voice had a sound I had never heard in it before, sharp, almost pleading. Then let her come stay with me for the school year. Caroline. Caroline, I am not joking. She is my niece. She is not a suitcase. There was a long silence, long enough for me to hear the cove through the open window. Then Ruth again, and now the sharpness had gone cold. That is not how it would look. That is your answer. That is the entire answer. Another silence. No, I am not trying to take anything from you. You cannot take what someone has already said goodbye to on the porch. I must have made a sound, Or perhaps the floor did it for me, because Ruth turned and saw me standing there in my nightie with my empty glass. Her whole face changed costume in a second, back into summer aunt. She said the school year in Cadgwith was long, nothing but slush and cousins. She walked me back up to bed with her hand warm between my shoulder blades. We never spoke about it. I was 12. I understood only the temperature of it. Something had been asked. Something had been refused. And the refusal had a reason my aunt found unforgivable. It would be 11 more years before I learned what Ruth had offered my mother that night, and what my mother had turned down, and the exact wording she had used to do it. Something changes in a girl the year she stops asking. My parents read it as maturity. Teachers called me self-sufficient. My mother repeated the word at dinner parties like it was a trophy she had won. What it actually was arithmetic. Around 14, I opened a spiral notebook and wrote a date on the first page, June 2018, the month I would turn 18, and hold an A-level envelope in my hand. And under it I started a list that was really a countdown. I did the math on everything. What a flat cost to rent in towns I had never seen. What a carnet for the M5 cost. What a 19-year-old could save in a year if she was careful and invisible. And invisible was my native language. The summer I was 17, I executed my first real operation. I asked to skip Cadgwith and stay home alone to work, and I watched my parents approve it in under a minute. No follow-up question while they packed for 2 weeks in the Outer Hebrides. So independent, my mother told the neighbors. The ease of that yes was its own diploma. I waitressed at an outdoor kiosk on the Camel Trail, the Camel River, named after the river, not the animal, every evening that summer, and every evening I banded my wages and slid them into an envelope taped inside my wardrobe behind the winter coats. On the envelope, I wrote a single word. Out. By A-level results, the envelope was a shoebox, and the shoebox held 4,800 pounds. Not one person in the house had ever asked what I was saving for. They assumed university. Let them. Universities send letters, and letters can be intercepted. I had already drafted my real plan the old way, in the Padstow Public Library with a paper ordnance map of the southwest coastline. They thought I was saving for tuition. I was saving for a door. My requirements were cold and simple. Far enough that nobody could drive there on a whim. Cheap enough to live on waitress wages, while I found better ones. And it had to need a baker because, thanks to my aunt, baking was the one thing my hands knew how to do better than anyone I had ever met under the age of 40. I flipped pages for weeks that spring. Then one afternoon I turned to a fold-out photograph of the Camel Estuary in late autumn. Yes, water in the title, like the opera, just so nobody gets lost. And there it was. A harbour town wrapped around a river so wide the tide flattened 2 miles of sand. Padstow. I sat there staring at that water, and I remember thinking it looked like Aunt Ruth's Cove. If Aunt Ruth's Cove had grown up and opened a Cornish deli. That was the whole ceremony. No pro and con list. Some decisions you recognize instead of make. I found 3 tea houses and a hot food kiosk in the town listings, wrote down the addresses on my pad, and mailed job inquiries with a return address that belonged to my friend Bethan, whose parents kept a holiday house in Rock and rarely checked the downstairs hallway. I told no one, not even Ruth, and leaving her out was the only part that felt like swallowing glass. But I knew my mother. I knew that after I vanished, every woman who loved me would be sat down at Caroline's kitchen table and questioned in that soft church voice. The only way to protect my aunt from having to lie for me was to make sure she had nothing to lie about. In May, an answer came back to Bethan's holiday house hallway. A tea room on the South Quay needed a kitchen hand starting in the summer. It paid almost nothing. I read it 4 times and slept like a queen. Results day was the 3rd Thursday of August 2018. The county's playing fields. Folding chairs on the grass. I was up before 5 that morning. And by 6:30 my mother's old silver Citroën estate, 600 pounds of my own summer wages, was packed and idling on the gravel. The green lantern in the boot, the shoebox of cash under the spare wheel, and beside it, lashed with twine, a wooden crate, because I had quietly carried home from Cadgwith the previous summer all 10 rosehip jars with the white labels and their single caption. Do not ask me why I brought them. At 18, I call them evidence. It took me years to admit they were a wound I was not done pressing. My parents did come to results day. I want to be accurate about this, because accuracy is the only revenge I have ever fully trusted. They came. They sat. And 11 minutes in, during the start of my row, my mother leaned over and whispered that they had to slip out early because Matthew's new apprentice ticket in Falmouth was throwing a celebration lunch, and traffic to the docks gets ugly. She squeezed my wrist.
"So proud," she said.
When my row finally stood and they read Iris and Thorne, I walked the platform, shook a stranger's hand, and looked out at 2 empty folding chairs with programs on the seats. And here is the strange part. It did not even hurt in the usual way. It felt like a receipt, like the universe itemizing one last time exactly what I had been to them so I could leave with the math finally done. My whole childhood, I had wondered if my plan made me the villain of the family. They left my results day early and I stopped wondering. That night I ate dinner with them. I said I was tired. I went upstairs. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I left. To anyone who has ever been the one who waited in the hallway while the family photograph got taken, I see you. You are not invisible. You have simply been practicing invisibility so long that you have forgotten anyone was meant to find you. We will come back to that. I left a note on the kitchen table, weighted down with the sugar bowl so it could not be mistaken for a flyer. I drafted it 30 times over the winter, and every draft got shorter because everything true I had to say kept collapsing into fewer words. The final version said, "I am safe. I am an adult. Please do not look for me." I signed it Lena, the way Ruth always shortened me, which was either a clue or a goodbye, and I have never decided which. Then I backed out of the gravel with my headlights off, and I did not turn them on until the end of the lane. 3 days. 310 miles. I slept twice in the Citroën at motorway service stations, doors locked, seat tilted back. Somewhere on the M5, I pulled over at a filling station, took my phone apart, swapped the prepaid SIM I had bought with cash in Exeter. My old number, the one my mother had, died in a bin outside Bridgewater. On the evening of the 3rd day, I came over a rise near Bodmin, and the whole Camel estuary opened up below me, the tide coming back through the cut, the harbour lights catching it sideways, and I had to grip the wheel because my hands wanted to shake and I did not have the spare attention to let them. 18 years old. Everything I owned in a hatchback. Nobody in the world knew where I was, and I mean nobody. You would think that would feel like falling. It felt like the first full breath I had taken since I was 8. Now, and I want you to hold this beat for a reason. 11 days after I arrived, somebody knocked on my door. The tea room that had hired me sat on the South Quay and was called Then Huffle and Sons. 40-something years old. Pine floor gone soft to soak. A single bay window looking out onto the Camel. It belonged to a man called John Maggs, who was 65 then and ran his kitchen like a small navy. I washed ramekins 11 hours a day, and my hands cracked, and I loved it the way you love anything that is entirely yours. I rented a studio flat above the harbour master's office for £320 a month, and when the storage heater died my first October, I did not call the landlord. I want you to notice that because it took me years to. I watched plumber videos on the library Wi-Fi, bought a thermal cutout for £9, and fixed it myself with the breaker off and my tongue between my teeth. I told myself that was thrift. It was not. It was doctrine. Needing things is a tax other people pay, and I would sooner have slept cold than knock on a door. Remember that about me. It is the flaw this whole story eventually turns on. The week before Christmas, the tea room's baker sprained her wrist, and John found me at the sink. "Anybody back there bake?" he asked the kitchen at large. My hand was up before my shyness could vote. He stood over me while I rolled out a test crust, arms crossed. I did it the way I had done it 100 times in a green caravan kitchen in Cadgwith. John took one bite, looked at me differently, and asked where I had learned. "My aunt," I said. "Then your aunt raised a baker," he said, and walked off. I stood there over that pie like it was a passport. The constable at my B&B door, back in those first 11 days, was younger than I expected and visibly bored, which turned out to be the best thing he could have been. My mother had filed a missing person report in Devon the day after results day. That report had followed the trail of my first contactless tap. a tank of petrol I had paid electronically before I got smart, and had ended with a welfare check at the door of my room above the harbormaster's office. I handed him my provisional driving license and my brand new council tax letter. He looked at both, looked at me, asked the only question the law actually cares about. Are you here of your own free will, miss? I said yes. He had me sign a form confirming I was a voluntary missing adult. Then he explained, in the tone of a man reciting a bus timetable, exactly how it works. Your family will be notified that you have been located. They will not be told where you are. That is your right. Have a good evening. And that was the whole miracle. The system my mother thought would fetch me home instead drew a legal curtain between us, and all her church voice could not part it, because the curtain does not negotiate. Before I changed numbers, one last voicemail had gotten through from her. I stood in that room and played it once. Iris, this is very dramatic, honey. We raised you better than this. Steady girls don't make a... And I deleted it right there, mid-word, and the room went quiet. It is the only time in my life I ever got to finish that sentence for her. For the next 4 years, that half a sentence was the last sound my mother's voice made in my life. 2 full years into Cornwall, the green storm lantern was still packed. I want to be honest about what that means. I had a flat. I had a job I was good at. I had a tenancy with my name at the top of it. And I had a lantern by the wardrobe door that I had not fully unpacked. Like some part of me was still standing on a porch in Cadgwith waiting for a car to come back. One Sunday night in my 3rd October, I finally opened it flat on the floor to empty it once and for all, and there at the bottom, lashed inside the wooden crate with twine, was the rosehip syrup. 10 jars. Skye to Lundy in order. My mother's round handwriting grinning up at me. Wish you were here. I carried the crate out back behind the huffle, where John kept a steel burn barrel for kindling, and I stood there with a firelighter in my fist for a long time. Then I went back inside. Not because I forgave anything, because burning them felt like one more disappearance, and I was tired of solving things by vanishing. Instead, I sat at the counter after close with a felt-tip pen, and I turned each jar over. And under my mother's caption, I wrote what that summer had actually been. Year 3. I taught myself to swim, because no one was there to watch me do it. Year 5. I stopped crying at drop-off, and everyone praised me for it. Year 8. Ruth asked me what I wanted for once, and I could not answer because nobody had ever asked the question. 10 jars. 2 handwritings. 2 versions of one childhood. I put the crate on the shelf above my AGA, where a person keeps things she actually intends to look at. I told myself I kept them as receipts. The truth is, some part of me was still waiting for someone to ask to read the other side. Every year in the 2nd week of June, I bought one postcard of Padstow Harbour, the tourist kind, all sales and Sainsbury's bags. No return address. No signature. No town visible on the front. On the back, where a message goes, I drew one small teapot with a curl of steam. And I mailed it to a cottage in Cadgwith. The 1st June I stood at the postbox for 10 minutes before I let it drop, running the risks like a bank auditor. Ruth would know. Ruth would recognize the steam loop. Ruth would have to hold this secret across a family that already considered her the odd sister. A postcard from no one to no one was the only mail that could not be questioned at a dinner party, because there was nothing to read. She never wrote back. She had no address to write to. But the following summer, a regular at the tea room mentioned she had a cousin down from Polperro, and I felt the 2 counties touch for half a second, and I went in the walk-in fridge and breathed until it passed. 5 postcards over 5 years. A teapot doodle instead of a name. That was our entire correspondence, and my aunt read it exactly right. She of all people knew how much a person could say on the back of a postcard. By my 3rd year, I was the tea room's baker. More and more I was running the kitchen when John's knuckles had their bad mornings, which was more mornings than he would admit. One February afternoon, he sat me down with 2 mugs of builder's tea and laid it out plain, the way he did everything. He wanted to retire while his knees still let him gut mackerel. The tea room was worth about £140,000 with the equipment. He had had offers. One from a young couple. One from a man who used the words panini press near his dresser drawers and was lucky to leave alive. "I am not selling 40 years to someone who will gut it," he said. "I would rather sell it slow to someone who will love it." Then he looked at me in a way that made the back of my neck warm.
30,000 down, he said.
I would carry the rest myself, monthly. Seller financing like they did it in the old days. For someone I trust. I went home that night and taped a sheet of graph paper inside my wardrobe door, and at the top wrote £30,000, and under it in pencil the number I actually had, 19,400. For the next year and a half that sheet was my religion.
Tips. Overtime.
No streaming. Boots resold instead of replaced. 21. 26. 29. People talk about buying a business. This was not that. This was the first thing I had ever wanted out loud at full volume, where losing it could actually hurt me. A place with my name on the deed. In a town I had chosen. Where nobody could ever again decide which members of a household counted as the family. John made only one condition.
"Do not disappear on me," he said.
I laughed. He did not. The article was John's idea, and I want that on the record, because for 4 years the whole shape of my life had one rule at the bottom of it. Stay small. Stay unfindable. A writer from Cornwall Life was doing a piece on Harbour Town tea rooms, and she had heard about our lardy cake. John, who had never met a spotlight he did not shove somebody else into, volunteered me. The writer wanted the baker's name and a photograph by the range. I stood in the kitchen with my hands in a tea towel, while every alarm I owned went off at once. And then I looked around at the slow winter that was coming, at John's arthritis, at the graph paper number that grew, or did not grow depending on how many strangers found this room. The tea room needed to be found. You cannot run a business on a witness protection heart. So I said yes. I stood by the ranges in a clean apron and smiled. And 3 weeks later, there it was, the lardy Cadgwith crossing the estuary for. My name in print. Iris Thorne.
First time in my adult life.
My face above the fold of a magazine I had never once been afraid of, because who in Devon reads Cornwall Life? For about 2 weeks I was proud in a way that felt like walking on a new floor, testing every board. Then the piece went online. And online does not have county lines. A woman I barely remembered, a second cousin of my mother's from Wadebridge, left a comment under the photograph 14 days after it went up. One short comment, with a question mark. Isn't this Caroline's girl? It was a Tuesday in late October, the dead hour between breakfast and lunch, when I was behind the counter boxing an order for a regular named Gus, and the bell over the door rang. I said, "We'll be right with you," before I looked up. Then I looked up. My mother was standing in the middle of my tea room. For years and 310 miles, and there she was between table 6 and the dresser drawers, in her navy wool coat, her hair grayer than the version I had been arguing with in my head all this time. Behind her, holding the door the way he held every door of my childhood, silently, was my father. He looked smaller. His free hand at his side was trembling with a fine, constant shiver. And some cold, clinical part of me noted it and filed it before my thoughts could even form a word. Nobody moved. The espresso machine hissed. I watched my mother take it all in with one slow sweep of the room she was so good at. The chalk menu with my cake list. The framed article by the till. The apron with the Huffle logo tied twice around my waist because it had been cut for somebody bigger. For years, whatever came out of her mouth first, I remember thinking, would tell me everything. The way a first sentence always had in our family. She finished her inspection. She looked at me, at my standing, solvent, unfussed life, and she pressed her lips together in that way that always came before the church smile. And she said, "So, this is what you left your family for." That was when I knew they had not driven 2 days to apologize. They had driven 2 days to collect something. I poured them coffee. I want you to understand why. Because it was not weakness. A woman who owns her own ground can afford to pour coffee on it. They sat at the counter like customers. And for 20 minutes, my mother gave me the authorized history of my childhood, and I listened to it the way you would listen to a tour guide describe your own house. In her version, I had had 10 wonderful summers with my aunt, of whom I was so terribly fond. In her version, they had given me independence, the greatest gift. Look how well it turned out. Look at this tea room. In her version, my disappearance was a phase, a cruelty she had borne with grace, and we need not relitigate it now that I had gotten it out of my system. Here is what frightened me.
Truly.
She was not lying. You can hear lying. My mother believed every syllable the way you believe a road you have driven for 38 years. Finally, I asked the question the 4 years had sharpened. Why did it take so long to find me? If any of this had mattered. And my father, my silent father, opened his mouth for the first time since the door. I did, he said, barely a breath in it. My mother's hand landed on his sleeve, light as a napkin.
He stopped.
Then she folded her hands on my counter and got to the business of the trip. Your brother, she said, cannot be expected to manage this on his own. He has the apprenticeship. The women. You understand. The words landed in exact grooves 10 summers had carved. Someone else's needs. And then me, the one without any. She reached across my counter and took my wrist, the same squeeze as on results day, and she said it. The sentence she had crossed 2 counties to deliver. You have always been the steady one, Iris. It is time to come home. Home for the memorial archive, she meant, to start. We'll tell everyone together. A family announcement. She was already at the guest list. I looked down at her hand on my wrist. French manicure. Her mother's ring. And the strangest thing happened. I felt the exact weight of it, and it weighed what a luggage tag weighs. For years, 310 miles, a legal curtain, a new name on a tenancy, a life built plank by plank with my own cracked hands. And the first full sentence my mother had for me was a job assignment. The vacancy for the steady one had reopened, and I was being recalled. I took my wrist back gently, the way you take a knife from a child. I said no. Not a speech. Not a trembling manifesto. Just the single word. And then, because the lunch crowd was 20 minutes out, I told them the kitchen needed me, and they should try the lardy cake before the drive home. My mother's face did something complicated and settled on wounded dignity, her home parish. On the sidewalk through the glass, I watched her reorganize my father towards the car, and he looked back at me once, and I did not wave, and neither did he. Somehow that was the most honest exchange the 3 of us had managed all morning. That night my phone rang from a Cornwall number I did not recognize. Matthew. I almost did not answer. I am glad I did. And I want to be fair to my brother the way I promised to be fair to everyone. He did not open with the family script. He opened with a question, quiet and off balance. Was it true you hated going to Aunt Ruth's? And I said, I never hated Ruth's. I hated what it meant. And I told him what it meant, all of it. The lantern in January. The porch. The jars. The line. The line went so quiet I checked the screen. Then my brother, 26 years old, said, Mum told me you loved it there my whole life. I believed her. His voice cracked on the last of it. He did not ask me to come home and nurse anyone. He asked one thing only. Do not disappear on me again. After we hung up, I sat a long time looking at the wooden crate on the shelf above my AGA. Here is the part nobody warns you about. Cutting contact is one decision, but staying gone is a decision you make every single morning. If you have ever had to choose between your peace and your family's version of you, hold on to that. It is the loneliest arithmetic in the world, and you are not the only one doing the math. I called Ruth the next night. She was quiet for a moment. Then my aunt took a breath and paid off a debt that was 11 years past due. You were 12, she said. You came downstairs for water. I know you heard some of it. Here is the rest. That summer she had offered to take me for the school year. Not a visit. Enrolled at the village primary in Cadgwith. My own room. Her paying for everything. She had the paperwork half-drafted. She had rehearsed it for weeks before she dialed. And my mother listened to the whole offer, all of it, and turned it down flat. And the reason she gave was not that she would miss me. The reason, word for word after all these years, was not how it would look. A daughter shipped off for good. People would ask questions. A daughter loaned out for summers, that was just cousins. That was wholesome. 10 summers was the maximum my absence could weigh, while the family portrait still hung upright. My childhood had been portioned out to the exact limit of appearances, like a ration book. I stood in my kitchen in Padstow holding the phone, doing the one piece of arithmetic I had never let myself do. It was never thoughtlessness. It was policy. Then Ruth said the other thing. I should have thought harder, sweetheart. Come to the memorial with me. Not for them. So, you never again have to wonder who you would be in that room. I did not sleep much for 3 nights. I would like to tell you the debate was about my parents, but it was mostly about a sheet of graph paper. 29,400. That was where the number stood. 600 short of shaking John's hand after 5 years of resoled boots. Going back to Cornwall's deep south was not a train ticket. It was a breach in the whole hull of my life. On the 4th morning, I did the thing I had never done in my adult life. I asked for help out loud, with the whole truth attached. I sat John down at his own corner table before open and told him everything. He heard me all the way out, arms crossed. Then he said, the tea room has been here 40 years. It can wait 3 weeks. And then, because John has never once missed the center of a target, he added, can you? I booked the train that afternoon. Exeter to Penzance, the day before the memorial luncheon. And then I did something I could not fully explain at the time. I got the green storm lantern down from above the wardrobe and packed it for the trip. 5 years it had sat there empty, retired. If I was walking back into that chapel, I was walking in with the lantern they had taught me on. Call it a witness. Some evidence you carry. Some evidence carries you. But before we get to the luncheon, I told you a few minutes ago that the photograph in the magazine was noticed first by my mother. I told you my father had already recognized me in the church newsletter 3 months before. We need to deal with that now because it is the reason I said yes to Ruth. I knew, going into that table, that somewhere in the house was a piece of paper my father had been carrying for almost 23 years. I just didn't know what was on it. It is not the thing I told you about. It is worse.
Hold on to that.
Penzance first. Ruth drove down the coast from Cadgwith and met me at Penzance station. The sight of her on the platform, grey now, scanning heads the way she used to scan the cove for me, undid more of my composure than the whole journey had. We got a guest house by the seafront. I want that detail noticed. 2 grown women with family in town, and we got a guest house. Because a boundary you cannot walk out of is not a boundary. It is a guest room. That evening we stopped by the house. A courtesy visit before the main event. And my childhood home performed an autopsy on itself for me, room by room. The hallway wall was Matthew in every era. Tiny t-shirt. RNLI jacket. Volunteers medal. Wedding. A museum with 1 wing. I appeared twice. Both in class composites. 1 face among 24. My old bedroom was a yoga room now. My mother said it brightly, as if delivering good news about real estate. And then, on top of the dresser in the dining room, I saw the other wooden crate. Her jars. The same 10 trips. The duplicates she had kept fanned in a wicker basket like potpourri. Curated. Displayed. Our family kept 2 archives of the same 10 summers. Hers in a basket for company to admire. Mine above a stove in Padstow, with the truth inked on the labels. Same jars. Different museums. My father walked me out to the car when we left. Under the porch light, the same porch light, he pressed a small envelope into my hand, folded tight, the way men of his generation fold anything they cannot say. His hand shook against mine from the tremor or the moment. I could not tell. Read it after was all he managed. I put it in my coat pocket, and it sat there all night ticking. The memorial arrived. A camera ready, because my mother produces events the way broadcasters produce finales. 12 for dinner. Both leaves in the table. The good china, with the white rims. Napkins folded into swans, which I have never seen in any other home in Britain. The guest list was the full repertory company, my grandmother's brother Ray and his wife, 2 of my mother's cousins from Street Colham Road, the Collett twins from next door, and Matthew's family, his wife Cara, their daughter Lily, who was 3, and was orbiting the dessert table like a small moon. I came with Ruth. I came carrying a lardy cake in a white box. And if you think that cake was only dessert, you have not been listening. It went honestly fine. Fine like glass. Fine small talk. Casserole logistics. Raise opinions about the new A30 widening. Then the turkey landed and the potatoes went around, and my mother stood up at her end of the table and picked up her wine glass and dinged it with a spoon. Ding, ding, ding. Before we eat, she said, I have some wonderful news to share with the family. Here is the thing about my mother and me. We had both come to that table with an announcement. She simply assumed hers was the only one. My mother stood at the head of that table like a woman who had rehearsed in the shower and delivered the news in 2 movements. First, the minor key. As you know, she said, Matthew's RNLI crew are going to name the new Padstow launch after him. It will be called the Matthew Thorne. The table did what tables do. Soft gasps, the wife's hand to her collarbone. Murmurs of, oh, lovely. My brother stared at his plate. My father looked up at me. And then my mother lifted her chin and modulated into the major key, the part she had driven 2 days to set up. But here is the wonderful news, she said. The chapel will house a permanent archive for him. A reading room. A small stipend. Iris is moving home to lead it. The room burst into exactly the response she had catered. Ray said, "Atta girl." One of the cousins actually clapped. 3 little pats. The neighbor woman dabbed her eye with a swan napkin and said, "What a good girl." And my mother received it all with a slow nod, the humble conductor, while her hand came to rest on my shoulder. And I understood I was the announcement the way the turkey was the centerpiece. And the déjà vu was so precise it was almost chemical. A bag bought in January, a trip booked in November, a daughter informed in June. 18 years later, the same machine. And the machine had never once considered that the part might decline. Then, into the applause, little Lily's voice rose from her high chair, clear as a dinner bell, with the one question nobody in that room could survive. She pointed a fork at me and asked her mother, "Who is that lady?" Cara hushed her, cheeks going red. But the question just hung there over the swans. Because out of the mouths of babes, the steady one was a stranger to the newest member of the family. I placed my napkin beside my plate. I stood. Here is what I had learned in 5 years of running a small business. You never outshout the room. You lower your voice until the room has to come to you. I stood until the last chuckle died on its own, and then I spoke at the volume you would use to read a bedtime story. You are right, Mum, I said. I never made a fuss. I made a life. And because I finally had the floor at that table, 22 years into being furniture at it, I kept my sentences short, and I placed them like settings. I am not moving home. Ray started to speak and thought better of it. But nobody in this family is going to say, I never made him a saint. So let me tell you what is actually true about my brother. My mother's face went through its repertoire. Wounded, then parliamentary. She tried the gavel. After everything this family gave you, I did not raise my voice at all. You gave me a lantern, Mum, every June. And with it a sentence. Steady girls don't make a fuss. It came out so quiet the table leaned in, and then the sentence finished detonating, and nobody's fork moved. I watched Ray's wife look at my mother, and I watched the look not bounce off, and that was new.
Second, I said,
I will visit Dad twice a year. I will call him Sundays. I come as a guest, invited, not assigned. Third, I said, my name is retired from family announcements. Nothing about my life gets stood up and told to a table again unless I am the one standing. That is the whole deal. It does not have a negotiation in it. My mother set down her wine glass with a click and went to her last resort, the oldest exit on the property. If you walk out of this house, she said, do not bother coming back. And there it was. The full price invoiced in front of witnesses. Then, into the silence, my niece Lily, who is not yet 4, reached across the table and pointed a small sticky finger at the lardy cake I had brought and asked very honestly, Mummy, can I have the lady's cake now? The room exhaled. A few people laughed. Cara tried to hush her. Lily was unmoved. And in that tiny question, the family got to be, for 2 seconds, a family again. Ruth spoke from the end of the table, very softly, to her sister across 50 years. Caroline, she said, she is not you. Let her go. My mother looked at me, and I did the only thing left that was both true and kind. I know, Mum, I said. No one asked you. That is why I am stopping this. So no one at this table ever has to be asked. They just get to belong. She did not answer. She sat down very straight, staring at the swan's chain. Then I turned to the one person who was still standing, my father. My dad stood at the head of the table with both hands on the wood, the tremor running through the cider glasses, and everyone waited for a speech that was never coming. He looked at me and said simply, "Read it." And so I did, right there, standing at the table because he had earned witnesses. And so had I. I unfolded the small envelope from my coat pocket. It was a photocopy of a clinic letter dated 1997, 14 months after Matthew's supposed remission. From a hospital in Plymouth. A second opinion consultation my parents had requested and never told anyone about. The phrase at the bottom of the letter, in plain consultant language, could not be argued with. No evidence of acute lymphoblastic leukemia on retrospective review of bone marrow slides. Original diagnosis, likely reactive lymphocytosis, secondary to viral illness. Recommend family counseling regarding unnecessary chemotherapy exposure in a minor patient. The table did not move. And underneath the letter, in my father's up-and-down print shop handwriting, gone shaky now at the tails, a note he must have written this week. Found out 3 years after. Your mother said bury it. Matthew was the only good thing we ever made happen. I buried it. I should not have. He stopped. I am sorry. And his voice broke open on the second word. I stood there holding 23 years of my family's founding document in my hand. It did not fix anything. My brother had been a healthy child pumped full of poison in the name of a fable. My father had buried the proof to keep the fable alive. But here is what the envelope also was. Proof that once, before the story got rewritten, someone in that house had looked. I folded it back up small the way he folds things, and I put it in my pocket for keeps. Then I stepped around the table and put my hand over his shaking one. You are not the steady one, Dad, I said. You never were. We are allowed to stop. Here is the ledger. 1 year on because I promised you accuracy, not a vow. The invite to the chapel archive arrived in March. Tasteful. No letter inside. Signed by my father, on his own line, by his own hand, for the first time in their marriage. Not signed, not love. Not signed steady. Just the name. Some doors do not slam in this life. Some simply settle closed. John and I signed in April. When the number came up short after the train tickets, he waved a hand and redrew the note himself. 25,000 down, instead of 30. The balance folded into the monthly for more years on the term. It will cost me more in the long run. And I signed it smiling because it turns out a dream with a lien on it is still a dream. There is a new line of paint on the tea room window under John's name. Small because I asked for small. Thorne, proprietor. The kettle is on. In July, a rental car pulled in off the estuary road, and my brother got out. And then from the back seat, he unbuckled his daughter. They stayed 4 days. Lily ate lardy cake with both hands and renamed me Aunt Cake, which I have legally accepted. And on the last morning, Matthew stood a long time at the shelf above my AGA, where the wooden crate of jars sits open now. He lifted each one and turned it over. His mother's handwriting on one side, his sister's on the other. He did not say anything for a while. Then he squared the jars, put the crate back, and said, I am sorry I never turned the cards over. That is the whole apology I got from Devon that year. And it was the only one that was ever going to matter. Which brings us to this year, to the longest table. We pushed every table in the huffle into one straight line, kitchen to window, and we fed whoever had nowhere better to be. Staff. Regulars. The new kitchen hand, whose family is in Cardiff. A widower named Gus who tips in firewood. 22 chairs. No swans. No announcements. John said grace in 2 languages. Ruth flew up. First plane she had boarded in a decade, and I put her at the head of the table, because every harbour should watch its true light eat. Before the cake, I handed her a postcard. Padstow on the front, all sails and sea glass light. On the back, in my handwriting, the old familiar greeting and its exclamation point. Wish you were here. She read it and laughed, and then did not laugh. She looked down the whole steaming length of that table, to the window and the real estuary beyond it. And for the first time in my life, the person the card was meant for was already in the room. The green storm lantern leaves on top of the pantry hutch now. It holds the cloth napkins for the long table. Twice a year I take it down, shake out the linens, and set the longest table in town with a lamp that was supposed to teach me to leave quietly. As for what I learned, it fits in one sentence. Family is not who shares your blood or your surname. It is the people who never need to send a postcard because they never let you be the one who is missing. That is my story. 10 summers. 1 green storm lantern. A porch in Cadgwith. A note in a coat pocket. 310 miles of motorway. A kettle. A chalk menu. A lardy cake. A clinic letter my father finally stopped burying. A brother who turned the jars over. A niece who will never have to be told she does not need anything. And a table with my name on the door. If you have ever sat in a hallway while the family photograph got taken, I see you. You are not invisible. You are simply Iris.